"Please buy us, human," the fallen alien warrior whispered. Her reason broke me without short heading 0342. His ship, the Frontier Wanderer, wasn't anything special. A mid-sized cargo vessel with temperamental engines and a navigation system that needed percussive maintenance more often than he'd like to admit. But it was his, paid for with 15 years of sweat and careful budgeting, and it took him from station to station hauling whatever needed hauling. Station Kyrath 9 was supposed to be a routine stop. Pick up a shipment of terraforming equipment, drop it off at the colony on Regulus Prime, collect payment, and move on. Simple. Clean. The kind of job that kept a man fed without getting him killed. Marcus had done it 100 times before on 100 different stations, scattered across the outer sectors. But the moment he stepped off his ship and into the station's main concourse, he knew something was different. The air felt wrong somehow, heavy with a tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The usual bustling chaos of a trade station was there. Merchants hawking goods, dock workers moving cargo, travelers from a dozen different species hurrying about their business. But underneath it all was something else, something that made his instincts scream. He'd learned to trust those instincts over the years. They'd kept him alive more than once. Marcus made his way through the upper markets, collecting his cargo manifest and signing the necessary documents. The station master, a four-armed Quellan with tired eyes, handed over the paperwork without his usual small talk. That was the second warning sign. The Quellan loved to gossip, always had some story about station politics or trade disputes. Today he said nothing beyond what was absolutely necessary. With time to kill before his cargo was ready for loading, Marcus decided to explore the lower levels of the station. It wasn't smart, maybe, but boredom had always been his weakness. The lower markets were where the real business happened, where things were bought and sold without too many questions asked. He'd picked up some profitable side contracts there before, but what he found in the lower markets that day would change everything. The crowd was thick, pressed together in a wide corridor that had been converted into an impromptu marketplace. The smell hit him first, unwashed bodies, stale air, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, desperation. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his human height giving him an advantage over many of the shorter species, until he found himself at the front of a gathering. That's when he saw the auction block. He'd heard about such things, of course. The Collective, the vast multi-species empire that controlled most of known space, officially endorsed slavery, but they didn't prohibit it either in their outer territories. It was one of those things that everyone knew happened but nobody talked about. Humans, being relative newcomers to galactic civilization, had mostly avoided the Collective's attention. Their worlds were too far out, too unimportant to bother with, for now, but seeing it in person was different. The auction block was a raised platform at the center of the corridor, surrounded by buyers examining the merchandise with cold, calculating eyes. And on that platform, chained and collared, were prisoners being sold like cargo. Marcus felt his stomach turn. He'd grown up on Earth hearing stories about humanity's own dark history with slavery, about the wars fought to end it, about the scars it had left on their species. Every human child learned about it, not as some distant abstract concept, but as a warning. Never again. Those two words were practically carved into human DNA. He should have turned around, should have walked away. It wasn't his business, wasn't his problem. Getting involved with collective politics was a good way to end up dead or worse. But then he saw them. The prisoners on the block weren't some species he didn't recognize. They were Valorans. Marcus knew about the Valorans the way everyone in the galaxy knew about them. They were legends, stories told in bars and trading posts. The warrior race that had stood against the Collective 15 years ago, fighting a desperate rearguard action while the rest of the galaxy cowered. The species that had been wiped out to the last individual, or so everyone believed. Except they hadn't been. Not all of them. The Valorans were tall, their bodies covered in feathers that ranged from deep blue to silver white. They had wings, not large enough for true flight in most gravities, but capable of short glides and intimidating displays. Or at least they should have been. The Valorans on the auction block had their wings broken and bound, the feathers matted and dull. Around their necks were thick metal collars that pulsed with a faint blue light. Suppression collars, Marcus realized. technology designed to block the Valorans' natural bioelectric abilities. There were 17 of them in total, scattered throughout the auction. Some were being presented to potential buyers, others waited in holding cages along the wall. All of them bore scars, marks of violence and degradation. But despite everything, despite the chains and the collars and the broken wings, they held themselves with a dignity that made Marcus's chest tight. The current Valoran on the block was female, her feathers a deep midnight blue beneath the grime. She stood straight despite the chains, her eyes scanning the crowd with fierce intelligence. The auctioneer, a fat Krillian with too many teeth, was rattling off her specifications in galactic standard. Former military officer, combat trained. Bioelectric abilities currently suppressed, but could be useful for manual labor or gladiatorial entertainment once properly conditioned. Marcus felt rage building in his chest. Rage and something else. Shame, maybe, that he'd walked into this thinking it wasn't his problem. The Valoran's eyes swept across the crowd and then stopped. On him. For a moment they just stared at each other across the space between them. Her eyes were golden, he noticed, like molten metal, and in them he saw not defeat, not despair, but calculation. She was thinking, planning, even now. Then she did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She mouthed 3 words in broken, heavily accented English. A language that most galactic species didn't bother learning because humans were too few and too scattered to matter. Please buy us, not me, us, all of them. Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest. This wasn't a plea born of desperation or defeat. This was strategy. This Valoran had recognized something in him, something in the way he carried himself or the human-made clothing he wore. She'd made a calculated gamble that this strange primate species might be different, that they might care. She was right. The bidding started at 2,000 credits. Low, because Valorans were considered broken merchandise, too proud to be useful slaves, too dangerous to keep without expensive suppression technology, too well known to be sold in more reputable markets. The few bidders showed only mild interest. Marcus didn't think, didn't plan. He just raised his hand and called out a number that represented everything he had. His entire cargo fund, his emergency reserves, every credit he'd saved over 6 months of careful hauling. The crowd went quiet, the auctioneer's eyes widened. The Valoran on the block stared at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, going once, going twice, sold to the human. It took him 3 hours to purchase all 17 Valorans, liquidating assets and calling in favors and trading away future contracts. His carefully built financial cushion evaporated. He'd be running on fumes for months, maybe years. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was insane. But the look in that Valoran's golden eyes kept him going. As station workers loaded the Valorans onto cargo sleds for transport to his ship, Marcus approached the female who'd spoken to him. Up close he could see the scars more clearly. Burns, lash marks, evidence of torture that made his hands clench into fists. She watched him approach with wary eyes. When he stopped in front of her, she spoke in that same broken English. "You are human. You know what it means to fight for freedom." It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded slowly. "I am Commander Jathira. These are my people. We need to speak somewhere private, somewhere without collective ears." Marcus glanced around. The auction was breaking up, buyers claiming their purchases and dispersing. He made a decision and gestured toward the loading dock. "My ship. Once we're aboard and I get those collars off you, you can tell me everything." Something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or the memory of hope. The walk back to the frontier wanderer felt like the longest of Marcus's life. The Valorans moved in silence, their chains clinking with each step. Station security gave them bored glances but didn't interfere. Just another batch of slaves being moved. Nothing to see here, but Marcus saw. He saw the way the Valorans watched everything with tactical awareness despite their chains. He saw the way they moved in formation even without speaking, maintaining sight lines and covering each other's blind spots out of pure instinct. These weren't broken slaves. They were soldiers enduring captivity. Once aboard his ship with the airlock sealed, Marcus went to work on the suppression collars. Human engineering was crude by galactic standards, but sometimes crude was exactly what you needed. The collars were designed to interface with Valoran biology, not to resist a good old-fashioned plasma cutter applied with careful precision. The first collar fell away from Jathira's neck with a hiss of released energy. She gasped, her whole body shuddering as her natural abilities returned. Blue lightning crackled across her feathers for just a moment before she controlled it. The other Valorans watched with desperate intensity as Marcus moved from one to the next, cutting away their chains. When the last collar hit the deck with a clang, Jathira finally spoke. Her English was better now, though still accented. "Thank you does not cover what you have done. You have bankrupted yourself for strangers." "Why?" Marcus set down the plasma cutter and met her gaze. "Because I'm human, and we have some strong feelings about people being bought and sold." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you deserve the truth, all of it, even the parts that will break your heart. The Frontier Wanderer was not designed for passengers. Its cargo bays had been hastily converted into living quarters, with thermal blankets and emergency rations distributed among the 17 Valorans who now sat in a loose circle around Commander Jathira. Marcus had given them space to clean themselves and tend to their wounds as best they could with the medical supplies he had on board. Now, several hours into their journey away from Station Kyrath 9, it was time for answers. Jathira stood in the center of the cargo bay, her wings partially extended now that the bindings had been removed. Even broken and scarred, she commanded attention. The other Valorans watched her with a respect that went beyond military rank. This was their leader, Marcus realized, not just by position but by choice. Marcus sat on a cargo container waiting. He'd learned over the years that sometimes the best thing you could do was shut up and listen. Jathira began to speak, her voice low and steady. 15 years ago, she said, the collective had come to the Valoran homeworlds with an ultimatum. Submit to their rule or be destroyed. The Valorans, being a proud warrior culture, had chosen to fight. They knew they couldn't win, not against the combined might of dozens of species and thousands of warships. But winning wasn't the point. The point was time. While the Valoran military threw everything they had at the collective fleets, while their warriors died by the thousands in desperate holding actions, their civilians were doing something else. They were preparing an exodus. 30,000 Valorans, mostly children and young adults, were loaded onto massive sleeper ships. These weren't military vessels, but Orcs, designed to sustain life in cryogenic suspension for decades if necessary. The ships were programmed with coordinates to a distant star system far beyond collective space where the survivors could rebuild. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He knew where this story was going. The sleeper ships launched in secret, scattered across different vectors to increase their chances. By the time the collective realized what was happening, the ships were too far away to catch without abandoning the siege of the Valoran homeworlds. So the collective made a choice. They let the sleeper ships go and focused on crushing the remaining Valoran resistance. And they succeeded. The Valoran homeworlds burned, the fleets were destroyed, the military was shattered. But a few thousand Valorans survived, including the command staff who had coordinated the evacuation. These survivors expected to be executed. Instead, the collective did something worse. They were kept alive, imprisoned, tortured for information about where the sleeper ships were heading. The collective wanted those 30,000 young Valorans, wanted them desperately. Not to kill them, Jathira explained, but to harvest them. Valorans possessed unique genetic traits that the collective believed could be weaponized. Bioelectric manipulation, enhanced reflexes, a natural tactical intelligence that made them superb warriors. If the collective could capture the sleeper ships, they could raise those children as weapons, breed them, control them. Marcus felt sick. The Valorans in the cargo bay were silent, their eyes distant. They'd lived this nightmare. The collective's interrogators were skilled, Jathira continued. They knew how to break people, how to find their limits and push beyond. Many Valorans died under interrogation. Others went mad. But the command staff, the ones who actually knew the coordinates, held firm. They endured years of torture, of degradation, of being sold into slavery and traded between owners like objects. All to protect a secret they carried in their minds. Commander Jathira herself had been interrogated 417 times over 15 years. She said this without emotion, as if reporting tactical data. She had scars across 90% of her body. She had been beaten, burned, starved, and subjected to methods she would not describe. And through it all, she never revealed the coordinates. None of them did. Marcus found his voice, though it came out rough. "Why are you telling me this now? Why trust me with information you've protected for 15 years? Because time has run out, Jathira said simply. The sleeper ships are programmed to wake their passengers when they reach a certain star system. The journey was supposed to take 15 years. In 3 weeks, those 30,000 children are going to wake up. And the star system they're heading toward is now deep inside collective territory. A military installation was built there 8 years ago. When those ships arrive, when the children wake up and send out their homing signals, the collective will be waiting. The silence that followed was crushing. Marcus stared at the Valoran commander, understanding flooding through him. She hadn't asked him to buy them out of desperation. She'd asked because she needed a ship. She needed someone outside the collective's sphere of influence, someone they wouldn't be watching. She needed a way to reach those sleeper ships before they woke up in enemy territory, and she'd gambled everything on a human being crazy enough to help. "How did you know I'd do this?" Marcus asked. "How did you know humans would care?" "We didn't," Jathira admitted. "But we know your history. The collective doesn't pay attention to human culture, considers your species too primitive to matter. But we studied you. When we were planning our resistance, we looked for allies, for species who might understand what we were fighting for. Humans were too far away to help militarily, but we learned about you. We learned about your wars, your revolutions, your civil rights movements. We learned that humans have died by the millions fighting against exactly the kind of tyranny the collective represents. And we learned that humans have a particular hatred for slavery." She looked directly at Marcus, her golden eyes fierce. "So when I saw you in that market, when I saw the way you looked at us on that auction block, I took a chance. I gambled that the stories about humanity were true, that you would not walk away." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks to cross half the known galaxy, reach the sleeper ships before they woke up, and somehow redirect them away from collective space. With a cargo hauler that could barely break .7 light speed, and a crew of 1 human and 17 escaped slaves who the entire collective would soon be hunting. It was impossible. Completely, utterly impossible. "I need to make some calls," Marcus said finally. Within an hour, the Frontier Wanderers' communication array was lit up with encrypted transmissions bouncing through a dozen relay stations. Marcus was calling in every contact he had in the human shipping network, reaching out to captains and crews scattered across the outer sectors. What the collective didn't know, what they'd never bothered to learn because humans seemed so insignificant, was that humanity had been running an underground railroad for years. It had started small. A human freighter captain finding a family of refugees hiding in a cargo container. Instead of turning them over to station authorities, the captain had helped them reach safety. Word spread. Other humans started doing the same. Soon there was an informal network, captains and crews who would transport refugees, smuggle dissidents, help people escape the collective's reach. They did it quietly, carefully, asking nothing in return except that the favor be passed forward. They did it because humans remembered what it was like to be the underdog. They did it because their history was full of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to help strangers in need. They did it because somewhere deep in human culture was the belief that some things were worth risking everything for. Marcus's calls were answered. One by one, human ships across multiple sectors began changing their courses. A mining vessel out of the Kepler colony altered its trajectory, citing equipment malfunctions. A colony transport carrying terraforming supplies diverted to investigate a distress signal that didn't exist. A family-run trading ship claimed engine trouble and drifted into a new sector. Individually, the movements meant nothing. Together, they formed a net, a web of human vessels slowly converging on a point in space. But they weren't the only ones moving. 2 days after leaving station Kyrath 9, the Frontier Wanderers' sensors picked up pursuit. 3 collective hunter ships, fast and well-armed, burning hard on an intercept course. Someone had noticed that Marcus's purchased slaves had disappeared. Someone had connected the dots. Jathira studied the sensor readings with a tactical eye. "Collective hunters are efficient but predictable," she said. "They rely on superior speed and firepower. They expect their targets to run in a straight line or surrender. We're not doing either," Marcus said. He was already plotting a course into the Kelrose Nebula, a vast cloud of ionized gas that played havoc with sensors and communication. It was dangerous, full of electrical storms and gravitational anomalies. Most pilots avoided it. But Marcus had grown up flying through the asteroid belts of the Sol system, where one wrong move meant instant death. He knew how to navigate chaos. The Valorans proved to be quick learners. As the frontier wanderer plunged into the nebula's outer edges, Jathira organized her people with military precision. They might not know human technology, but they understood tactics. They understood how to work as a team. Within hours, they'd figured out the ship's weapon systems, the shield generators, the sensor arrays. They couldn't operate everything efficiently yet, but they could assist. The first hunter ship caught up to them deep in the nebula. It came out of the electrical storms like a shark, weapons hot, demanding immediate surrender. Marcus's response was to dive deeper into the storm, using the Wanderer's smaller size to navigate between plasma columns that would fry the hunter's sensors. The Valorans worked the weapon systems, their bioelectric abilities giving them an edge in targeting. Blue lightning crackled from Jathira's hands as she interfaced directly with the firing controls, her natural talents augmenting the ship's computers. When the hunter ship tried to follow them through a particularly dense storm cluster, the Valorans were ready. A perfectly timed salvo caught the hunter's engines, and the larger ship tumbled out of control into an electrical vortex. One down. But the other two hunters were learning. They started working together, coordinating their approaches, trying to box the Wanderer in. For 6 hours, it was a deadly game of cat and mouse through the nebula. Marcus flew like a man possessed, pushing his ship to its limits and beyond. The Valorans fought with a fierce joy, freed from their chains and finally able to strike back at their tormentors. Then the call came through. One of the human ships in the network, a transport called the Dakota's Pride, had encountered collective forces. They'd fought back, tried to buy time for other ships to escape, but they'd been outgunned, overwhelmed. The last transmission was the captain's voice, calm and steady even as his ship broke apart around him. "Tell them it was worth it," the captain said. "Tell them we didn't hesitate." The line went dead. Marcus felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. People were dying for this. Humans who'd signed up to haul cargo and instead found themselves in a war they'd never asked for. All because he'd made a choice at an auction house. Jathira found him in the cockpit afterward, staring at the stars beyond the nebula. She said nothing for a long time, just stood beside him. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Is it worth it? All these people risking everything for 30,000 kids they've never met." The Valoran commander was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Marcus would never forget. "Your captain said to tell you it was worth it." He already knew the answer. Humans seem to understand something that the rest of the galaxy has forgotten. That the value of a person is not in what they can do for you, but in the simple fact that they exist. That children deserve a chance to grow up free. That some things are worth dying for because without them, living means nothing. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her talons gentle. "You asked me why we trusted you. This is why. Because humans remember what it means to be human." The frontier wanderer limped out of the Kelros Nebula 3 days later, scarred and smoking, but still intact. 2 collective hunter ships had gone in after them. Only one came out, and it retreated badly damaged. Marcus had lost count of how many close calls they'd had, how many times they'd come within seconds of being vaporized. But they'd made it through, and more importantly, they'd bought time. The human network had been busy while Marcus was playing hide and seek in the nebula. Ships from a dozen different sectors were now moving in a coordinated pattern, creating false sensor trails and distress signals across collective space. It was chaos, carefully orchestrated chaos designed to spread the collective's forces thin. They couldn't chase every human ship, couldn't investigate every anomaly. And while they were distracted, Marcus and his unlikely crew were burning hard toward the coordinates Jathira had finally shared with him. The sleeper ships were heading for a system called Vahara 7, a binary star with 3 rocky planets that had once been considered worthless real estate. Now it housed a collective military research facility, surrounded by defensive platforms and patrol fleets. The kind of place you didn't just fly into unless you wanted to die quickly. But the sleeper ships didn't know that. Their programming was 15 years old, based on star charts from before the collective's expansion. When they arrived in 13 days, they would send out automated homing signals announcing their presence. Every collective ship in the sector would converge on their location within hours, unless someone reached them first and changed their course. Marcus sat in the cockpit running calculations that refused to add up. Even at maximum burn, pushing his engines past safe limits, they would reach Vihara 7 with only 2 days to spare. 2 days to locate 30,000 people in cryogenic sleep scattered across multiple ships, wake them safely, explain the situation, and convince them to trust a human they'd never met and change course into unknown space. And that was assuming they got there at all. The communication console chimed. Marcus accepted the encrypted transmission and watched as a dozen faces appeared on his screen. Human captains from across the network, checking in from their various positions. They looked tired, worn down by days of running and fighting. But they were still there, still moving, still committed. A woman with gray hair and laugh lines around her eyes spoke first. "This is Captain Rodriguez of the merchant vessel Constellation. We've drawn off a collective patrol group in Sector 9. They're chasing us toward the border regions. Should buy you another 12 hours before they realize it's a diversion." "Captain Zhang here," said a young man whose ship was clearly taking fire even as he spoke. The screen shook with each impact. "We're engaging collective forces near the Tarsi's junction. They think we're trying to establish a smuggling route. Let them think it. We'll keep them busy as long as we can." One by one, the captains reported in. They were scattered across 100 light years, each playing their part in the elaborate shell game. Some were running, some were fighting, all were risking everything for people they'd never meet, for children who didn't even know they were in danger. Marcus felt the weight of it crushing down on him. "These people are dying for my decision," he said quietly after the transmission ended. "The Dakota's pride is gone. Captain Hernandez's ship took heavy damage and had to make emergency landing on a neutral station. God knows how many others will lose before this is over." Jathira was beside him, as she often was these days. She'd taken to spending time in the cockpit, learning human systems and sharing Valoran tactical knowledge. They made a strange team, the human freight hauler and the alien warrior, but it worked. "They are not dying for your decision," she said firmly. "They are dying for their own choices. Each captain knew the risks. Each one chose to help anyway. Do not dishonor their sacrifice by taking away their agency." Marcus looked at her, saw the scars she bore from 15 years of torture, and nodded slowly. She would know about sacrifice. The days blurred together. The Frontier Wanderer pushed forward at speeds that made the engines scream. The Valorans worked around the clock, managing systems, running repairs, preparing for what was coming. They jury-rigged human weapons with their bioelectric abilities, creating hybrid systems that shouldn't work, but somehow did. Jathira proved to be a genius at tactical innovation, finding ways to combine human unpredictability with Valoran precision. On the 6th day, they made contact with another human ship. The vessel was a retrofitted warship, one of the few pieces of actual military hardware that humans had in the outer sectors. It was called the Defiant, which Marcus thought was about as human a name as you could get. Its captain was a grizzled veteran named Morrison who'd fought in the border skirmishes against pirates. "Heard you could use an escort," Morrison said over the comm. "His ship fell into formation beside the Wanderer. Seems like you've got half the collective looking for you." "Thought you might appreciate some extra firepower." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. "You know this is probably a one-way trip, right? We're flying straight into a collective military installation." Morrison laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "Son, I'm 73 years old. I've hauled cargo, fought pirates, survived 3 different plagues, and buried 2 wives. If I'm going out, might as well be doing something that matters. Besides, my grandkids are going to love this story, assuming I live to tell it." 2 days later, 3 more human ships joined them. A colony transport, a mining vessel, and a family trader. None of them were warships. None of them had any business going into combat, but they came anyway because that's what humans did. They showed up for each other, even when it was stupid, even when it was dangerous, even when every rational calculation said to run the other way. The Valorans watched this gathering with something like awe. Their culture understood military honor, understood warriors who fought for their people. But this was different. These humans weren't soldiers. They were merchants and miners, families and freelancers. They had no stake in this fight except the belief that it was right. "Your species is insane," one of the younger Valorans said to Marcus. He didn't sound critical. He sounded amazed. "Yeah," Marcus agreed, "we really are." With 10 days left, disaster struck. A collective patrol group found them, not hunters this time, but a full military squadron. 6 warships with shields and weapons that made the human vessels look like toys. They appeared out of hyperspace with weapons already charged, broadcasting demands for immediate surrender. Morrison's response was to open fire. What followed was less a battle and more a desperate scramble for survival. The human ships scattered, using every trick they knew. The colony transport ejected cargo containers filled with debris, creating sensor interference. The mining vessel deployed industrial cutting lasers that were never meant for combat, but could still slice through hull plating. The Defiant threw itself at the collective formation, drawing fire away from the weaker ships. And the Frontier Wanderer, with 17 Valorans channeling their abilities through its weapons, became something unexpected. A cargo hauler transformed into a predator. Jathira coordinated the Valorans with practiced efficiency. They linked their bioelectric abilities together, amplifying each other's power, feeding it through the ship systems. Blue lightning crackled across the Wanderer's hull as they fired, each shot guided by tactical instincts honed over lifetimes of warfare. They destroyed one collective warship outright, its shields overloaded by the unexpected power surge, damaged 2 others badly enough that they fell back. But the human ships were taking losses too. The family trader took a direct hit to its engines. The captain managed to evacuate most of the crew to escape pods before the reactor went critical. The mining vessel lost half its hull to a missile strike and had to retreat. The Defiant fought like a cornered wolf, Morrison's voice steady over the comm as he called out targeting solutions and tactical adjustments. Then Marcus saw it, a gap in the collective formation, a window that would stay open for maybe 30 seconds. Not enough time for everyone to escape, but enough for one ship. He made his choice. All ships break off and scatter, Marcus ordered. We're going through. Morrison's protest was immediate. You'll never make it alone. Watch me. The Frontier Wanderer accelerated, pushing toward the gap with everything the engines had left. The collective ships realized what was happening and tried to close the opening, but the other human vessels threw themselves at the enemy formation, sacrificing their escape to buy Marcus those precious seconds. The Defiant rammed a collective cruiser head-on. Morrison's last transmission was a rebel yell that would have made his ancestors proud. The colony transport detonated its remaining fuel tanks, creating a fireball that engulfed 2 enemy ships. Marcus flew through the gap with collective weapons fire lighting up space all around him. The Wanderer shook with impacts, alarms screaming, but they made it through. They broke free of the collective formation and jumped to hyperspace, leaving the battle behind. In the sudden quiet that followed, Marcus slumped in his chair. Half the network was gone, good people, brave people, dead because they'd believed in something bigger than themselves. Jathira placed a hand on his shoulder. She understood loss. They will be remembered, she said quietly. When Valoran children ask who saved them, we will tell them about Captain Morrison and his Defiant, about the Dakota's pride and the Constellation, about humans who fought not for glory or profit, but because it was right. The Frontier Wanderer continued its journey, battered but unbroken. 7 days remained until the sleeper ships reached Vahara 7. 7 days to cross the remaining distance, to find a way through collective defenses, to reach 30,000 sleeping children before it was too late. Marcus looked at the star charts, at the impossible distance still ahead of them, and made a decision. He opened a channel to every human ship still in the network. This is Marcus Webb of the Frontier Wanderer. I know what we've lost. I know what this has cost. If anyone wants to turn back, I understand. No one will think less of you. But if you're still willing, if you can still fight, then meet us at Vahara 7. Because in 1 week, we're going to do something crazy. We're going to steal 30,000 people right out from under the collective's nose. And we're going to show this galaxy that humans don't abandon kids. Not ever, not for anything. The responses came in slowly, one by one. Ships that had scattered during the battle, that were damaged and limping, that had every reason to run for safety. But they didn't run. They changed course toward Vahara 7, because they were human, and humans specialized in impossible rescues. Beside Marcus, Jathira spread her broken wings as far as they would go. It was a Valoran gesture of respect, of solidarity. We will succeed, she said with absolute certainty, because we must. Because those children have waited 15 years for freedom. And because you humans have reminded us what it means to never surrender. The stars stretched ahead of them, cold and distant. But somewhere in that darkness, 30,000 young Valorans were sleeping, unaware that a human freight hauler and his impossible crew were racing against time to save them. The collective thought this story was over 15 years ago. They were about to learn the without short heading 0347. Three collective cruisers patrolled the outer regions while smaller patrol craft swept through the asteroid belt. At the center of it all sat the research facility, a massive station bristling with sensors and communication arrays. And somewhere in the dark between those stars, three sleeper ships drifted on their programmed course, carrying 30,000 souls who had no idea they were heading into a trap. Marcus had 2 days. 2 days before the sleeper ships entered the system proper and triggered their automated homing signals. 2 days to find them, wake them, and get them out. With 17 Valorans, a cargo hauler held together by determination and welding patches, and whatever help the human network could provide. The odds were laughable, which is probably why Marcus was grinning. The human ships began arriving throughout the day. Not many, not after the losses they'd taken, but enough to matter. They came in ones and twos, battered vessels that had no business being anywhere near a military installation, a medical transport, 2 freighters, an asteroid mining platform that had somehow gotten its engines working well enough to limp into position, and 3 more converted warships, their captains as crazy as Morrison had been. They gathered at a debris field just outside the sensor range of Vahara 7, using the wreckage of an old battle to mask their presence. 12 ships total, crewed by maybe 200 humans who decided that some things were worth everything. Marcus stood in the cargo bay of the Wanderer looking at the faces on his communication screen. Captains young and old, experienced and green, all waiting to hear the plan. The problem was he didn't really have one, not a good one anyway. Jathira stepped forward. She'd been working with the other Valorans for days now, planning and calculating, using their combined knowledge of collective tactics. She brought up a holographic display of the Vahara 7 system. The sleeper ships will enter here, she indicated a point on the outer edge. Their homing signals will activate automatically when they detect the star system's unique gravitational signature. From that moment, we have approximately 4 hours before every collective ship in 3 sectors converges on this location. 4 hours to locate 3 ships in a solar system, wake 30,000 people and get them out. One of the human captains, a woman named Chen, shook her head. That's not enough time. No, Jathira agreed, which is why we are not going to wait for them to arrive. We are going to find them first. She expanded the display, showing the trajectory of the sleeper ships. They are still 2 days out, but they are following a predictable course. If we send small teams in fast ships, we can intercept them before they enter the system. Board them. Wake the passengers manually, and redirect them before the homing signals ever activate. And what about those collective cruisers that are going to notice us the second we start moving around? Chen asked. That is where the second part of the plan comes in, Jathira said. We create a distraction, something big enough to pull their attention away from the outer system. What kind of distraction? Marcus asked, though he had a feeling he already knew. Jathira's golden eyes met his. The kind where we broadcast the location of every enslaved Valoran in collective space. All 6,000 of them. Every prison camp, every auction house, every research facility where our people are being held. We send it on every frequency, encrypted so only those who want to find it will look. The collective will panic. They will assume it is a rescue operation, that we are coming for all of them. They will have to respond. The silence that followed was heavy. Broadcasting those locations meant giving up any leverage they had. It meant the collective would move the prisoners, hide them, maybe kill them rather than let them be rescued. It was sacrificing 6,000 lives for 30,000. Unless, Jathira continued, her voice steady, the rescue operation is real. She looked at the human captains on the screen. I know your network. I know you have been helping refugees escape for years. What if this time you help all of them? Every station, every market, every prison within range. Human ships show up with weapons and currency and righteous anger. You do what you did for us. You buy them, you free them. You make the collective understand that humans do not tolerate slavery anywhere. It was insane. It was impossible. It would require coordination across dozens of sectors, hundreds of ships, resources they didn't have. Chen was the first to laugh. It was a sharp, fierce sound. My grandmother escaped Earth during the water wars. Made it to the colonies with nothing but the clothes on her back and a promise that her children would never bow to anyone. She'd love this plan. Other captains started nodding, talking over each other with ideas and suggestions. Marcus watched them, these ordinary people planning an extraordinary act of defiance, and felt something warm in his chest. Hope, maybe, or pride in his species. The plan came together over the next 18 hours. Teams were assigned. 3 fast ships would intercept the sleeper vessels. The rest would scatter to coordinates across collective space, ready to hit slave markets and prisons simultaneously. It was coordinated chaos, the kind of thing that could only work if everyone trusted each other completely. And somehow they did. Marcus would lead the team to intercept the first sleeper ship. Jathira and 5 other Valorans would go with him. 2 other human vessels would handle the remaining sleepers. The timing had to be perfect. They'd board the ships, wake the passengers, upload new navigation coordinates, and get out before the collective knew what was happening. Meanwhile, the broadcast would go out. Every human ship in the network would receive the locations of imprisoned Valorans. And they would move, all at once, a coordinated strike across collective territory that would look like an invasion. The collective wouldn't know which targets were real and which were distractions. They'd have to split their forces, defend everything, trust nothing. And in that chaos, maybe, just maybe, everyone could slip away. The first sleeper ship appeared on sensors exactly where Jathira had calculated. It was massive, larger than Marcus had imagined, its hull scarred by 15 years of micrometeor impacts and cosmic radiation. It drifted silent and dark, its passengers sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger waiting ahead. Marcus brought the Wanderer alongside and extended the docking collar. The seal was tricky, the sleeper ship's airlock being an older design, but they managed it. Jathira led the way inside, moving through the darkened corridors with reverent care. The cryogenic chambers stretched in rows, thousands of them, each containing a sleeping Valoran. Children, teenagers, young adults. All of them frozen in time 15 years ago, preserved at the moment when they'd said goodbye to their parents and boarded these ships with hope and fear in their hearts. Jathira stopped in front of one chamber, her hand pressed against the cold glass. Inside was a young female, maybe 14 in human years, her feathers still showing juvenile patterns. The commander's voice was barely a whisper. "My daughter. I put her on this ship myself." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He'd wondered why Jathira had endured 15 years of torture without breaking. Now he knew. She'd been protecting her own child. "Let's wake them up," he said gently. The revival process was delicate. Wake them too fast and the shock could kill them. Wake them too slow and they'd run out of time. Jathira and the other Valorans worked with practiced efficiency, their knowledge of their own biology crucial. They started with the medical staff first, waking doctors and nurses who could help with the others. The first Valoran to wake gasped, her eyes flying open in confusion and fear. Jathira was there immediately, speaking in their native language, gentle words of comfort and explanation. The young doctor looked around, saw the commander's scarred face and broken wings, and understood in an instant that something had gone terribly wrong. But there was no time for grief. They had work to do. As more Valorans woke, the sleeper ship came alive. Medical teams moved through the chambers, carefully reviving their patients. Engineers examined the ship systems, finding them still functional despite 15 years of drift. And Jathira stood before the growing crowd, explaining everything. The fall of their homeworlds. The sacrifice of their parents, the trap waiting ahead, and the humans who'd come to save them. The young Valorans listened in stunned silence. Some cried, some raged, but all of them understood what needed to happen next. Across the system, the broadcast went out. 6,000 locations, transmitted on encrypted channels that the collective would eventually crack, but not immediately. Within hours, human ships across dozens of sectors began moving. They descended on slave markets with weapons drawn and credit accounts ready. They breached prison facilities. They showed up at auction houses and research labs with a simple message: release the Valorans or face consequences. The collective's response was predictable panic. They scrambled forces, trying to protect all their assets simultaneously. The cruisers at Vahara 7 received urgent orders to deploy elsewhere, leaving the system's defenses weakened. That's when the second and third sleeper ships were intercepted. More Valorans woke to find their world transformed. More children learned they'd been saved by a species they barely knew existed. And in the chaos, as collective forces spread thin trying to protect 6,000 targets, 3 massive sleeper ships changed course. Their new coordinates pointed toward human space, toward colonies on the edge of known civilization where 30,000 refugees could hide and heal and eventually rebuild. Marcus sat in the cockpit of the Wanderer, watching the sleeper ship's engines ignite for the first time in 15 years. They were beautiful, those old vessels, graceful despite their scars. Beside each one flew human escort ships, protecting them as they accelerated away from Vahara 7. The collective would realize eventually what had happened. They'd understand they'd been tricked, that the real prize had slipped through their fingers. But by then it would be too late. Incoming transmission, one of the Valorans called out. It's from multiple sources, the rescue teams. Marcus accepted the transmission and felt his heart soar. Captain after captain reported success. Freed Valorans being loaded onto human ships. Prison facilities left empty. Slave markets in chaos. Not every mission succeeded. Some teams ran into heavy resistance. Some didn't make it out. But hundreds of Valorans were freed, maybe thousands, pulled from bondage by humans who refused to look away. Jathira stood beside her daughter, who'd been among the first woken. The young Valorans stared at the human ships with wonder. They did this for us, for people they never met? Yes, Jathira said quietly, because humans remember what it means to fight for freedom. Because they believe some things are worth everything. The journey to human space took 3 weeks. The sleeper ships, escorted by what remained of the human network, traveled through routes that avoided collective patrols. They stopped at neutral stations for supplies, and word spread. Other species heard about what happened, about humans who'd declared war on slavery itself, about Valorans who'd endured 15 years of horror to protect their children. The story grew with each telling, becoming legend. When they finally reached the outer colonies, the human settlements opened their doors. 30,000 Valorans stepped onto human worlds for the first time, greeted not as refugees but as honored guests. Communities that had little to spare somehow found enough to share. Humans who'd never met an alien before welcomed these proud warriors into their homes. Marcus stood with Jathira on the landing platform, watching as young Valorans explored their new home with cautious optimism. Her daughter was among them, laughing at something a human child had said, the two of them communicating more through gestures than words but understanding each other perfectly. "Thank you does not seem adequate," Jathira said. "You bankrupted yourself. You lost friends. You started a conflict with the collective that may never end." Marcus shrugged. "We did what humans do. We saw people who needed help and we helped. Simple as that." Jathira extended her hand in the human gesture of respect. "Then let me offer something in return." The collective thinks they've seen the last of the Valorans. They think we're broken. But these 30,000 children aren't refugees anymore. They're survivors. They're warriors. And they have allies now. The collective created an enemy when they enslaved us. But you've given us something more dangerous than revenge. You've given us hope. And hope is a weapon that tyranny can never defeat. Marcus gripped her hand firmly. "Welcome to humanity, Commander. We specialize in making the impossible happen, usually out of pure stubbornness." 6 months later, the collective faced something they never anticipated. Coordinated strikes against their facilities. Guerrilla warfare led by Valorans who knew every weakness in their systems. Human ships running supplies and reinforcements. A resistance movement spreading like wildfire through oppressed sectors. And at the center of it all, a former slave and a freight hauler who'd proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't technology or numbers. It was the simple human refusal to accept that some things were inevitable. The galaxy was changing. The collective was learning a hard lesson. You never enslave someone in front of a human, because humans remember, and humans don't forgive. And when humans decide something is wrong, they'll burn down the universe to make it right. 30,000 young Valorans grew up on human worlds, learning human history alongside their own. They learned about underground railroads and civil rights movements. About ordinary people who did extraordinary things because someone had to, and they understood. They'd been saved not by military might or political power, but by something simpler and more profound, by people who believed that every life mattered, that children deserved freedom, that some things were worth everything, The collective would eventually fall, brought down by the very tyranny it had embraced. But that's a different story. This story ends with Marcus Webb standing on a colony world, watching Valoran children play with human kids under an alien sun, and knowing that sometimes the smallest choices create the biggest changes. He'd walked into a slave market planning to ignore it. Instead, he'd started a revolution, and he'd do it again in a heartbeat, because he was human, and humans specialized in making tyrants regret their life choices.